We all have that one family member who doesn't scare easily. You know the type. The man who fixes his own truck, sleeps with the window open in the dead of winter, and laughs at horror movies. For me, that was my grandfather, Elias. He was a man cut from granite. He spent 40 years working for the Forestry Service in Washington State. He wasn't a man given to flights of fancy. He didn't believe in Bigfoot, he didn't believe in aliens, and he certainly didn't believe in ghosts. If you asked him about the supernatural, he'd just spit on the ground and tell you to get back to work. That is, until the Thanksgiving of 1998. That was the first and only time I saw him truly afraid. He was sitting in his armchair, a glass of whiskey trembling in his hand, something I'd never seen before. The power had gone out due to a storm, and the wind was howling outside, sounding like a screaming woman. I asked him if he was okay. He looked at me, his eyes wide, staring past me, staring into a memory I couldn't see. He took a long drink, set the glass down, and finally told me the story of why he quit the fire watch service in 1971. This isn't a story about a sheet with holes cut in it. This is a story about isolation. It's a story about what lives in the deep, untouched parts of the American wilderness. The year was 1971. My grandfather had taken a seasonal job manning a fire lookout tower in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. For those who don't know, a fire tower is basically a small cabin perched on top of a 50-foot wooden scaffolding. You are high above the tree line. You have windows on all four sides. Your job is simple, to watch for smoke. It sounds peaceful, just you, the radio, and the beauty of nature. But people forget how loud the silence is. The tower he was assigned to was called Blackwood Station. It was one of the older models, creaky and smelling of pine tar and old canvas. It was miles from the nearest paved road. To get groceries, he had to hike down a trail for 4 miles to where he parked his truck. He was completely alone. For the first 2 weeks, it was routine. Grandpa would wake up, brew coffee on a propane stove, check in with the base station on the radio, and scan the horizon with his binoculars. It started on a Tuesday. The air was thick, heavy with static. A storm was brewing off the coast, rolling in over the mountains. The sky had turned that bruised purple color you only see before a bad storm. Grandpa was cleaning his binoculars when he heard it, a low, rhythmic whistling sound, like someone whistling a happy tune, but very far away. He stopped and looked out the west-facing window. Nothing but a sea of green pine trees swaying in the wind. He figured it was the wind whistling through the metal railings of the catwalk outside. He went back to cleaning. 10 minutes later, he heard it again, closer this time. It was a tune, Yankee Doodle. Now, my grandfather was a rational man. He assumed it was a hiker, maybe some lost camper wandering off the Pacific Crest Trail. He grabbed his megaphone, stepped out onto the catwalk, and yelled down. He told them to identify themselves. His voice echoed off the mountains. Silence followed. He waited. He scanned the tree line below the tower. The trees were dense, creating deep shadows even in the daylight. Then he saw it. About 50 yards from the base of the tower, standing perfectly still next to a massive Douglas fir tree, was a figure. It was wearing a yellow raincoat. The hood was up. It was just standing there, facing the tower. Grandpa felt a wave of relief, thinking it was just a hiker. He yelled out that they couldn't camp there because a storm was coming in. The figure didn't move. It didn't look up. It didn't wave. It just stood there, rigid, like a mannequin dropped in the woods. Grandpa went back inside to grab his radio to call it in, just standard protocol. When he came back out 10 seconds later, the figure was gone. That night, the storm hit. In the Pacific Northwest, storms aren't just rain, they are violence. The wind battered the tower, making the whole structure sway. The cables groaned. Rain lashed against the glass like handfuls of gravelin. Grandpa tried to sleep, but the atmosphere in the cabin felt wrong. You know that feeling when you're in a room with someone else, even if you can't see them? You can feel their presence. The cabin felt crowded. Around 2 in the morning, the radio crackled to life. Now, the radio shouldn't have been active. The base station signed off at 8 in the evening unless there was an emergency. Grandpa sat up in his bunk and called out to base. Static. Then a voice cut through the white noise. It repeated his exact words from earlier. It said, "You can't camp here. Storm's coming in." Grandpa froze. His blood drained from his face. It was his own voice. It wasn't a recording. In 1971, they didn't have digital recorders up there. It sounded like him, but wrong. It sounded metallic, tinny, like someone trying to act like him. He grabbed the microphone and asked who it was. The radio went silent for a moment. Then the voice came back, louder, repeating the command to identify himself. He turned the radio off. His hands were shaking. He told himself it was just cross-chatter. Sometimes atmospheric conditions can bounce radio waves, creating loops. He was a man of science. That had to be it. He lay back down, pulling the wool blanket to his chin, gripping his flashlight. He was just drifting off when he heard the footsteps. Heavy, wet boots walking on wood. Thump, thump, thump. Not inside the cabin, outside, on the catwalk, 50 feet in the air. The catwalk is made of metal grating and wood. It creates a very specific sound. Someone was walking around the perimeter of the cabin. Grandpa held his breath. He knew the lock to the hatch was locked. He had locked it himself. The footsteps were slow and deliberate. They stopped right in front of the window above his bunk. Grandpa slowly reached for the curtain. He knew he shouldn't look. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to stay in bed, but he had to know. He moved the curtain just an inch. Lightning flashed, illuminating the catwalk. There was nothing there, but on the glass, on the outside of the window, was a single muddy handprint. But it wasn't a normal hand. The fingers were too long. They had too many joints. The next 2 days were a blur of paranoia. The storm raged on, trapping him in the tower. The trail down was washed out. He was stuck, and the thing outside was getting bolder. It stopped hiding. During the day, Grandpa would see the yellow raincoat standing at the edge of the clearing, but every time he looked, it was closer. First 50 yards, then 30, then right at the base of the tower stairs. He realized then that the raincoat was empty. It didn't hang like there was a body inside. It hung flat. Whatever was wearing it wasn't human. On the 3rd night, the power to the generator died. Total darkness. Grandpa sat in the center of the room with his hunting rifle across his lap. He had barricaded the door with his heavy table. At midnight, the scratching started. It was scratching at the door, not knocking, scratching, like a dog wanting to be let in. Then the voice came back, but it wasn't coming from the radio this time. It was coming from the other side of the door. It asked to be let in. It said it was cold, but it wasn't his voice anymore. It was his wife's voice, my grandmother, who was safe at home in Seattle. It begged him to open the door, claiming she had hurt her leg. Grandpa cocked the rifle and screamed at it to get away. The voice on the other side changed instantly. It dropped an octave, becoming a deep, guttural growl that vibrated the floorboards. It mocked him, screaming back his own words with a distorted, animalistic laughter. Then the doorknob began to turn. The lock strained. The wood groaned. The thing was incredibly strong. Grandpa aimed at the door. He was ready to fire. He was ready to die. Then the smell hit him, the smell of ozone, sulfur, and rotting meat. It seeped under the door, filling the small cabin. It made his eyes water. It made him gag. He sat there for 6 hours, gun pointed at the door, listening to the thing pace around the catwalk, round and round, whistling Yankee Doodle, tapping on the glass. It never broke the glass. It could have. I think it could have ripped that tower down if it wanted to, but it didn't want to kill him. It wanted to terrify him. It was feeding on his fear. When the sun finally rose, the noises stopped. Grandpa waited until noon before he dared to open the door. The catwalk was covered in mud, but not just mud. There was a slime, a thick, translucent residue that trailed from the... I've worked a lot of dead-end jobs in my life. I've been a janitor, a line cook, and a warehouse packer. But the only job that ever made me question my sanity was a security gig I took back in 2009. I was living in a small town in Ohio at the time, and I was desperate for cash. When I saw an ad in the paper for a night watchman at the old St. Mary's Hospital, I didn't hesitate. The pay was double the minimum wage. The only catch was that the hospital had been closed for 20 years. It was slated for demolition, but until the wrecking ball came, the city needed someone to make sure kids didn't break in to steal copper wire or smash windows. The interview was short. The supervisor, a guy named Miller, looked tired. He didn't ask about my experience. He just handed me a flashlight, a heavy set of keys, and a walkie-talkie. He told me the shift was from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. He gave me one specific instruction that I thought was strange at the time. He told me that if I heard anyone talking on the 3rd floor, I shouldn't go up there to investigate. He said it was just the pipes settling, and the acoustics in the building played tricks on your ears. I laughed and told him I didn't believe in ghosts. He didn't laugh back. He just looked at me with this grim expression and told me to keep the doors locked. The first 3 nights were boring. The hospital was a massive, rotting beast of a building. It smelled like mildew, rubbing alcohol, and something sweet, like decaying flowers. My station was in the security booth in the main lobby. I had a bank of monitors showing grainy black and white feeds from the few CCTV cameras that still worked. Most of my time was spent reading paperbacks and drinking lukewarm coffee. On the 4th night, the rain started. It was a heavy Midwest thunderstorm that rattled the glass in the front doors. Around 2 a.m., I was doing my rounds on the 1st floor. I walked past the old reception desk and the empty waiting room chairs that were covered in dust sheets. It felt like walking through a graveyard. I checked the side exits, making sure the chains were secure. Everything was quiet except for the thunder rolling overhead. When I got back to the security booth, I sat down and looked at the monitors. That's when I saw it. Camera 4. Camera 4 covered the long hallway on the 3rd floor, the psychiatric wing. The screen was flickering, rolling with static, but I could clearly see that one door was open. I knew for a fact that I had locked every door on that floor during my initial check. I leaned in closer to the monitor. The hallway was empty, but the door to 302 was wide open, spilling darkness into the corridor. I grabbed my flashlight and the radio. I remembered what Miller had said about not going to the 3rd floor, but I figured it was some teenagers who had broken in. I wasn't going to let some kids vandalize the place on my watch. I took the stairs because the elevators had been dead for a decade. The air got colder as I climbed. By the time I reached the 3rd floor landing, I could see my breath misting in the beam of my flashlight. The smell was stronger up here, that sickly sweet smell of old flowers. I walked down the hallway. The linoleum floor was peeling, crunching under my boots. I reached room 302. I shined my light inside. It was empty, just an old metal bed frame and a broken chair. No kids, no copper thieves. I stepped inside to check the window, thinking maybe they came in through the fire escape. The window was painted shut. There was no way in or out. I turned to leave, and that's when I heard it. A giggle. It was soft, wet, and came from the corner of the room behind me. I spun around, sweeping my light with the room. Nothing. My heart started hammering against my ribs. I told myself it was the wind. I stepped back into the hallway and locked the door. I tugged on the handle 3 times to make sure it was secure. I walked back to the stairwell, walking a little faster this time. I just wanted to get back to the safety of the booth. As I reached the stairs, I heard the sound of a door opening behind me. Click, creak. I froze. I didn't want to turn around. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I had to look. I turned my head slowly. Room 302, the door I'd just locked, it was wide open again. And standing in the doorway was a nurse. But she wasn't right. Her uniform was torn and gray with age. She was standing perfectly still, facing away from me, looking into the dark room. Her neck was bent at an impossible angle, like it was broken. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice shaking. "You're not supposed to be here." She didn't move. She didn't breathe. Then the radio on my belt crackled to life. It was startlingly loud in the silence, but it wasn't Miller on the other end. It was a voice that sounded like it was underwater, bubbling, choking. It whispered, "Don't let her turn around." I dropped the flashlight. It rolled across the floor, the beam spinning wildly. In the strobe light effect of the rolling light, I saw the nurse begin to turn. Her body didn't move, only her head. It twisted around slowly, grinding boon against boon. I didn't wait to see her face. I ran. I scrambled down the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, nearly falling. Behind me, I heard footsteps, not the sound of shoes, but the sound of bare feet slapping against the wet floor. Slap, 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 fast, unnaturally fast. I burst into the lobby and sprinted for the front door. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so bad I dropped them. I could hear the slapping sound coming down the stairs. It was getting closer. I risked a glance backward. The nurse was at the bottom of the stairs. She was on all fours, crawling like a spider, her limbs twisted and broken. She looked up at me. She had no eyes, just empty black sockets that wept a thick black liquid, and she was smiling, a smile that was too wide for a human face. I found the right key. I jammed it into the lock and twisted. The bolt slid back. I threw the door open and tumbled out into the rain. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I locked the doors and peeled out of the parking lot, leaving skid marks on the asphalt. I called Miller the next morning and quit. I told him I found a better job. I didn't mention the nurse. I didn't mention the voice on the radio. He didn't seem surprised. He just asked for the keys back. I mailed them to him. I wasn't going back there. A few months later, I looked up the history of St. Mary's. It turns out the 3rd floor was a psychiatric ward for the criminally insane back in the 50s. In 1958, a nurse was killed by a patient in room 302. He had snapped her neck. I still work security, but now I work at a mall. It's bright, it's loud, and there are always people around. But sometimes late at night when I'm checking the security cameras, the screen will flicker, and for a split second, I'll see that hallway. I'll see the open door, and I'll see her standing there waiting for me to turn around.